Welcome, one and all, to the movie for What If Naofumi with Shao Kahn. Now, I know you guys have been waiting for a little while now, so I'm not even going to hold you guys for too long. Let's just get on to the video. Naofumi Iwatani lived a rather ordinary life. He wasn't anything special, but he wasn't a bad kid in a sense. Essentially, he was just your ordinary kid. He played some MMO games, but that was when he was younger, around the age of like 12 to 14 years old. He found himself more intrigued with the conquering aspect of some of these games, though. Some of them were hyper realistic at times, and they would involve him being able to rule over kingdoms, conquer different lands, see his land prosper, and all of that. He found this to be admirable with some of these games. As a matter of fact, he would praise how realistic and how sensible some of these games were with how it felt to conquer nations. It just gave Naofumi a thrill. School unfortunately ended up getting the better of Naofumi though, so he would eventually have to quit playing video games for a while in order to focus on his education. And thanks to his focus on getting an education, he would have ended up making it into college, and he would actually major in political science. While in college, for one of his assignments one day, he would have apparently been required to read some sort of fictional book about heroes and the political system that they lived in. Then he would have to point out the flaws within said system. He found it to be a rather demeaning, you could say, assignment, but it was easy, so he wasn't really one to really complain, at least not verbally. While exploring the library, he would actually end up finding a book that he supposed fit the description of what his teacher was talking about. He kind of snoozed off in class when the teacher was talking about it, and he only got some of the details. He only vaguely remembered the name of the book, but he figured he would just find out later from one of his friends in the class if he got the right book or not. It was really not that big of a deal for now for me. This book that he ended up picking up was talking about there being four heroes, though. Four heroes that were summoned to another world in order to protect the people there. It seemed rather silly at first, but he kept reading, wondering if it would get any better soon. These heroes apparently wielded legendary weapons such as a sword, a spear, a bow, and a shield? These guys were literally called sword hero, spear hero, bow hero, and then you just have a shield hero. Now for me, kind of had to laugh about that. Unless this guy acted like Captain America with his shield or something along those lines, and now for me didn't see how a shield could possibly be an effective weapon in battle. There was apparently another hero the book mentioned though, and this would have been the Warhammer hero. At least that was his name, and they seem to be a rather fiercely loyal soldier to their kingdom. They were extremely devoted to any and all missions they were given by the kingdom. Their power was unmatched in combat. Naofumi found this book to be rather stupid, in all honesty. As a matter of fact, he found it to be an insult to his intelligence. He didn't understand why it would be called the four heroes if there were five, and the fifth one was as strong as well. Why was it necessarily that the Warhammer hero was so much stronger than the other four heroes? So if that was the case, then what was the whole point of having the other four heroes in the first place? Why even have the book be called why even have the book be called the four heroes, or at least like be titled after there being four heroes? It just did not make much logic to now for me. The last page that he ended up reading was something about the Warhammer hero sacrificing himself in battle to protect the buffoon of a king. Honestly, while reading it, that's genuinely how Naofumi felt about the king. This king was an idiot, and these heroes literally worked under the king for whatever reason. He just did not understand why they would work under somebody who was literally just going to see their whole nation collapse due to their idiotic moves. He wanted to put the book back, hoping to find that he made a mistake in his selection of books, but a bright red light would actually exude out of the book one moment later, and this would actually end up enveloping Naofumi. He would be forced to shut his eyes from the intensity of the light, and when he sensed that the light was gone, he would slowly open up his eyes again, only to notice that he was in a completely different environment. It looked rather medieval in nature. There were three guys who were in the same vicinity as him, showing equal confusion on their faces. They were wielding weapons though. One wielded a bow, another wielded a spear, and the third a sword. Wait a minute. Naofumi would realize that this was eerily similar to the book he had read earlier. He was hoping that he didn't end up becoming the shield hero, and to Naofumi's pleasant surprise, he didn't. As a matter of fact, Naofumi ended up getting the warhammer as a weapon. He could work with that. The hammer even felt relatively light in his hands. Some mages would actually appear before the four heroes and explain that the king wished to speak with them. The four would be introduced to the king of this country, and he would actually request to learn their names. Naofumi would initially be skipped over, but Motoyasu would actually call out the king for skipping over Naofumi. After Naofumi got his chance to introduce himself, the king would go on to actually explain the reason for why the four of them were summoned here. Apparently there were these catastrophes known as the waves, where dangerous monsters would be summoned to their kingdom with their only intention being to kill. The four of them were summoned here in order to protect the kingdom from any further waves, since they barely survived the last one on their own. With the strength of the four heroes, they would be sure to survive this time around. At least that was the king's hope. Naofumi would actually speak up after hearing the story though. Well, the story behind why they were summoned here. He would bring up a question. What exactly would they gain from all of this? The king had a visible look of confusion, and Naofumi would elaborate. There was a good chance that after the heroes fulfilled their purpose here, the kingdom would most likely just send them back from whence they came from. Or like from just whence they came, I don't know where I added from. For all they knew, time could still be moving regularly in their own dimension as well, meaning that there could be missing reports for them. The kingdom took them from their families and friends. They had lives before being summoned here, so why would they ever want to help this kingdom? The other heroes began to murmur, realizing that Naofumi had a good point. He said everything that was on their minds and things that they didn't even consider at first. Everything and more. Naofumi was making very valid points. The king would actually begin to sweat, realizing just how easily he lost favor with the heroes. And in a way of, gaining their trust back, he would explain that the heroes would be rewarded greatly for their efforts, with riches, prestige, and even women if they truly wished for that. And when it came on to like this whole mention of time running differently, the king couldn't really speak much about that, but if they really desired to go back to their original homes after they were finished with the waves, then so be it. They would make sure to put their best efforts in sending them back to a time when, they were just summoned back to their realities right before they were summoned, you could say. So say if you were playing video games, say if you were playing video games in your basement, then you would be transported back there with time not actually moving. Or at least that was the king's theory. Motoyasu would actually be interested in hearing about the woman part of it all. The other heroes could be well, they were all convinced. All except Naofumi. You see, Naofumi was still skeptical, but he would take it for right now. Depending on how the situation went, though, he would maybe have to demand more. The heroes would end up sharing sleeping quarters together for the night, and they would end up talking to each other about their situation in private. The world reminded most of them of a video game, but they couldn't agree on which one. After some more discussion with each other, they would end up finding out that they came from different versions of Japan, interestingly enough. Naofumi would actually reveal that he wasn't really one to play video games. He used to, but you see, college, yeah, that made him too busy to actually wind down and play, especially like how he used to, where he would be playing for 4, 5, shoot, even 6 hours straight sometimes. Matter of fact, his schedule of sleep was completely out of whack because of him playing video games, and college was what basically forced him to get out of that habit of going to sleep at 2 a.m. and after playing a good 8 hours of video games. Instead, it would be 8 hours of doing homework, coursework, that sort of deal. The other heroes found it to be kind of lame that he didn't play any video games and that he was just a dull college student. But hearing his major, they supposed it made sense, and Naofumi kinda had to laugh hearing that they considered him lame for not playing video games. Although, like, some people would consider Naofumi going in and trying to get a good career to be rather smart, as opposed to spending all your time playing video games and not really doing anything with your life. But to each their own, he supposed. He was a rather endearing character with the way he talked as well. That's something that the other heroes had to admit. He actually inspired confidence in them, made them feel more powerful, and he was easily agreeable with. Although he didn't play video games, he at least had a strong weapon in the form of a warhammer as well. It's not like he got a shield or anything. That would have been rough. Ren would actually comment on whether or not the hammer was heavy for Naofumi, considering he didn't look like someone who had an imposing presence, while the hammer looked like something more befitting for a strong man or a very muscular person, because the hammer looked like it weighed around 40 pounds. Naofumi, he would shake his head though, explaining that it was actually incredibly light for him. Ren would be rather surprised hearing this, but he would quickly figure that the weapons just adjusted to their physical capabilities at the moment. They wouldn't dwell on it for too long since they had a long day tomorrow. The next day, the heroes would end up coming to the king's throne room, where they would be introduced to potential party members meant to help them during the waves, and to Naofumi's surprise, they wouldn't be the ones selecting the members, but rather it would be the other way around. Naofumi would end up actually getting no team members at first, and Motoyasu would bring out the possibility of some of the kingdom's natives probably eavesdropping on their conversation last night. They probably didn't feel comfortable being guided by a guy who didn't understand how their world functioned. Naofumi would feel rather bitter about the situation. The king, though, would actually offer Naofumi more money in comparison to the rest of the heroes, considering his predicament. But Naofumi, he would refuse the offer. He explained that he didn't want the man's pity. A redhead by the name of Melty would actually try to offer herself up to the Warhammer hero as a party member, but he would actually decline as well to this offer. He would explain that he would form his own party on his own. He didn't want to take from anybody else's party. He didn't want any sort of handouts whatsoever. He wanted to become strong and powerful on his own. He wasn't trying to be mean or anything, he was just being honest. Naofumi would take a certain amount of money from the king with a similar amount to the other heroes. Or, well, I could phrase this better. Naofumi would take the same amount of money as other heroes, and he would leave to quickly gain experience points. The king will comment on how Naofumi had the right idea, separating from the rest of the heroes, since they wouldn't actually gain any experience if they tried working together. It was just the nature of the legendary weapons. They didn't completely understand how the legendary weapons work, but that was just something that they managed to observe over the years. Naofumi would have been in the middle of slaughtering some orange balloon monsters, but he would notice after a while that he wasn't really getting anywhere. Sure, he managed to go up a couple of levels, but after this couple of levels, it was practically that he was stagnant. Instead of, while dealing with the orange balloon monsters for even longer, Naofumi would have to move on to fighting stronger monsters if he wanted to make any sort of progress in this world whatsoever. He would take the remains of the balloons and sell them at some monster markets for a pretty okay price. He needed money since the king's, money was only going to get Naofumi so far. He would probably spend most of it on armor, in all honesty. Naofumi would have also ended up investing some time learning about the currency of this world before heading over to a local weapons shop, where he would actually meet a man by the name of Erhard, who actually sold weapons and armor at a pretty good deal. Naofumi would get some pretty cheap armor for now, since he was going to go light on the spending until he gathered up a big enough party. He would also try buying a sword, but when he tried grabbing it, he was shocked with the system, explaining that he could only use a weapon that he was summoned to this world with. No other type of weapon could be used, and Naofumi would just tick in discontent. He would thank Erhard for his time and rent a room to a local inn for the night while also buying himself a meal. He would rest his armor on the floor and rest for the night. But when he woke up in the next morning, he would notice something a bit off. You see, his armor was missing. So was his money, actually. At this moment, Naofumi would realize something. He was robbed. Yeah. And Naofumi, he would immediately begin to panic, and he would leave his room, hoping that he could find the culprit behind the robbery. Or, burglary, you could say. And guards would surround Naofumi immediately after. Naofumi would have been relieved to see them and tried to explain that he had been robbed, but they weren't listening to him whatsoever. Instead, they would try to tell him that the king had actually requested his presence, which confused Naofumi. What did the king want with him? Naofumi would end up meeting with the king, who had a scowl on his face. They would explain the situation to Naofumi. Apparently, Naofumi had committed a heinous act last night. That being the harassment of one of Motoyasu's party members, mine. Naofumi would look over to the three other heroes, but more specifically Motoyasu. By the way, I apologize for the mistake I made earlier, calling her Malty when it should have been mine, but it's whatever. He realized that the man was wearing his armor, and he would call him out for this. But Motoyasu would actually deny this. He would explain that Mine got this armor for him as a gift. She had departed from the group for a bit in order to find something that could be of use to Motoyasu, which ended up bringing her to some weapon shop, where she managed to find some pretty okay armor. He would have never expected for her to come back in such a fearful state, though. She would have ended up explaining everything to him, everything that Naofumi apparently tried to do to her when they crossed paths. The fact Naofumi couldn't even own up to his own misdoings showed what kind of a man he really was. Naofumi would be angered hearing this, and he would call out everyone here for their idiocracy, the stupidity. The king would try to silence Naofumi, but Naofumi, he would snap at the king as well. He wouldn't allow for them to spread these false allegations against him and ruin his name. There were several things off with their allegations. For one, he bought that armor from Erhard's shop, not mine. They could even go to the man's shop in order to confirm it. Another thing off with their statements was that Naofumi's receipts showed that he ended up staying at an inn for the night. He did nothing but fight monsters, sell their skins, get armor, and sleep at an inn. That's all he ever did that whole day. The king would try to deny Naofumi's statements, but green energy would actually suddenly form in Naofumi's eyes before shooting at the king. He intentionally missed, though. It felt like an itch around his eyes when he used that move. He didn't know what it was at first, but he did know that this was a new skill. He didn't understand what it was at first. All he really understood was that this was apparently a new skill that he just somehow unlocked. It would have actually popped up on this menu for whatever reason, and it would have actually explained that it was some sort of mysterious form of energy that he could develop over time, and this was interesting. That could be of use to him in the future. Motoyasu would continue to antagonize Naofumi though, but the other heroes would be silent, thinking long and hard about Naofumi's words. His own testament added up more than mine's own. To coincidentally meet Naofumi when he seemed to be the type that was more goal-oriented. Even in a different world, Naofumi showed a fair amount of more intelligence than the others, so to even attempt that was kind of weird in their opinion. From the little they knew of Naofumi, what he did to mine seemed very out of character, but Motoyasu would actually be rather unconvinced, and he would be tired of Naofumi's statements. He would immediately try to rush at Naofumi, ready to attack. He would go in for a punch, but it would quickly be blocked and countered. The force behind Naofumi's punch was enough to leave Motoyasu rattled. He wasn't expecting for Naofumi to have that much strength behind his punches. He said he majored in political science, so he thought he would just be a scrawny nerd with no real strength behind him whatsoever. But he was apparently wrong. Everyone there would be left in shock at what they saw. This wouldn't have been the end of it though. You see, Naofumi, he would actually grab Motoyasu by the neck and lift him up. Sort of, Darth Vader style, and he would demand that Motoyasu give him back what was rightfully his. Motoyasu would actually refuse, but Naofumi's eyes would begin to glow again. Motoyasu would realize at this moment what he was going to do, and he would end up complying with his request reluctantly. The king would demand that Naofumi leave his presence after regaining his composure, and Naofumi would just give him a rude gesture, showing how little he cared for his authority. He would wait for Motoyasu to give him back all of his armor before walking up to the king's throne. He would rest his hand on the king's shoulder before whispering in his ear that he better enjoy the time that he still had left on this little throne of his. One day Naofumi was going to take everything away from this man for his actions today. He would leave the capital afterwards. Apparently the rumor had been spread throughout the capital of what Naofumi supposedly did to mine, and people, they would just give Naofumi crude looks. He didn't care anymore though. He knew he was innocent. These people were going to regret framing him. He was going to make sure of it. Naofumi would end up being cornered by Erhard though while walking through the capital. He was angry, but simply looking at Naofumi's eyes, he could tell that Naofumi was innocent. He would actually let go of Naofumi, and Naofumi would be glad to have finally have somebody on his side, somebody that at least had a brain in this world. These sort of false allegations seem to stay true no matter what would he. Well, these sort of false allegations seem to stay true no matter what world he went to. And this was how it was in Japan, the US, all of these countries. He had studied politics before, and he realized that this was just some sort of political move. And he realized that this was probably the same thing in this world as well, but he wondered why this was even the case. Why would they try and go against the Warhammer hero? A lot of these things, they just weren't adding up, but Naofumi would get this information later on. For now, Naofumi, he would just explain the situation to Arahide, and the man would genuinely feel bad for Naofumi. He would offer him his support by giving him a bag of silver to get through for the next couple of days. And although Naofumi didn't really like handouts, he took this as an act of good faith. He appreciated this, and he would remember this kind gesture for later on as well. For now, Naofumi would end up venturing outside of the capital. He would find himself fighting monsters continuously, gaining XP and unlocking more abilities as time went by. Besides simply swinging his hammer to crush the monsters that dared to get in his path, Naofumi would have also taken a liking to this mysterious green energy skill. It seemed to apply more to just that of him being able to shoot energy beams out of his eyes. He could also shoot them from his hands and was on the verge of creating constructs with them as well. He was having a bit of difficulty with that though. Sometimes the constructs would properly materialize, while other times it just failed on him, simply disappearing instead of properly forming into a construct or even just blowing up in his face. In the middle of the night, Naofumi would end up encountering some thugs who thought Naofumi would be some easy pickings. It was hard to see who he really was while in the dark, so they figured that he was just some nobody. They had numbers, while Naofumi, he just had a hammer that seemed to be too heavy for his scrawny appearance. It was only when Naofumi's eyes glowed green did they realize what they were really going up against. They would immediately try to sing a different tune, understanding that Naofumi was a rather strong hero, even if he was still new to this world. They had heard the stories about how he was simply able to just manhandle the spear hero. At least that's what the rumors said anyways. And they just did not want any smoke anymore. The thugs knew they didn't stand a chance against Motoyasu, so fighting Naofumi just sounded like a death wish. They would try to bargain with Naofumi, offering to join his party in exchange for their lives being spared, and Naofumi would think about it for a second before denying their request. He would end up swinging his hammer at the thugs, leaving them in a battered state. They were lucky enough to have survived though, since Naofumi didn't see them as even worth killing here. They were just that weak and pathetic in his eyes. A merchant would get Naofumi's attention right after though. He would offer Naofumi a possibility of while recruiting party members that would be absolutely loyal to him no matter what. This piqued his interest. It sounded too good to be true. Then again, the merchant was in no position to lie either. If he tried to deceive Naofumi, he would just end up like the guys on the floor as well. Speaking of the thugs actually, Naofumi would bend down and steal whatever sort of money they had on them at the time. It was only fair in his eyes since they were planning on doing the same to him. He'd follow the merchant to his base of operations. There he would realize that this man was no mere merchant, but rather a slave trader. Oh no. He would offer Naofumi some of the best slaves that he had. The prices though, they were just a bit too much for Naofumi right now though. Although he had a fair bit amount of money at this point from his expeditions hunting monsters, he still needed to save some money to eat and, well, have a place to stay at for the night as well. Naofumi would request to know about his more affordable slaves, explaining his price range for the current moment. Hearing what Naofumi was looking for, the slave trader would lead them over to where his weaker slaves were. There he would see a sick fox girl who was being sold for little to nothing. She was going to die in a couple of days from the seams of it, so he wouldn't really see a point in purchasing her. He would just move on. And he would actually encounter a creature that resembled a killer whale. They seemed strong. Naofumi would ask a couple of questions about this slave, and Naofumi would be intrigued. The price they were being sold for, it sounded like a steal in his opinion as well. He would purchase them in a heartbeat. The slave trader would place a slave mark on Naofumi's new servant, and he would be fascinated finding out the mechanics of the mark. He could basically control their actions and movements if he really wanted to. If they disobeyed, there would be consequences as well. He liked that. The slave trader would also offer Naofumi a lottery egg with the possibility of him actually getting a dragon out of it. The chances were slim, but it was worth a shot. Naofumi would grunt before deciding to spend a little more in order to, well, get the egg. Naofumi would immediately put his new slave to work by having them defeat monsters of all sizes. He needed to get familiar with their fighting style and what could be done in order to improve it. To his surprise, even with some sort of rusty weapon that Naofumi gave them, they seemed to be rather adept at fighting, and Naofumi would even witness them using some magical attacks as well. Well, basic magic attacks, but magical attacks nonetheless. It seemed that this demi-human, or like the Yatsu type, or like how we pronounce it, this crossbreed, this humanoid killer whale, seemed to have an affinity towards magic and, well, fighting as well. Things were just getting more and more interesting for Naofumi. With them as part of his party, Naofumi also gained XP from all of their attacks. They'd make a fair bit amount of money from the dead monsters and use some of their hard-earned money in order to stay at another inn for the night. There was only one problem with the inn though, and that it was only fit for humans. The wickedness or kindness, basically they were simply too big to fit in. Naofumi would be disappointed, but figured that there wasn't really anything he could do about the situation. He would sigh, and he would comment on them maybe possibly shrinking down to fit human standards or human size. He didn't actually think that the Orkiness was actually going to do it, or that they were even capable of doing it. He was just speaking out loud, speaking his thoughts aloud, and sure enough, the Orkiness, to Naofumi's surprise, was apparently able to transform into a small boy with white hair, and their clothes seemed to have a special property that allowed it to stretch and shrink whenever he transformed as well. Naofumi would be surprised to see this. He didn't actually expect for them to turn into a human or have a human-like appearance. This was a rather convenient surprise. The two would rest up at the inn, and while there, Naofumi would get to know the boy. At first, he thought they were mute with how unresponsive they were, but that turned out to not necessarily be the case. They just did not trust Naofumi that much at first. He didn't blame the boy though. After all, he did buy the boy as a slave. And there was even a slave mark and everything. He would get the kid some food when realizing that he was hungry, and he would even let him pick what he wanted from the menu. The money wasn't too much of an issue this time around. This would cause the boy's eyes to widen in surprise. He hadn't been treated like this before. It seemed that today was just full of surprises for the two of them. When he ordered a particular meal, he immediately winced, expecting for Naofumi to lash out against him, but nothing happened. He ended up getting the exact meal he wanted, and Naofumi paid for it all. By the end of the meal, the boy would look down at his plate and state that his name was actually Alex. Naofumi would be pleased hearing the boy finally speak. Even while ordering his meal, the boy simply pointed at what he wanted. He was beginning to earn the boy's trust, the fact that he was actually beginning to speak to him now. That was a good sign in Naofumi's eyes. He wanted somebody on his team who would be loyal to a fault, someone who would be willing to die for Naofumi. The two would just continue journeying and hunting monsters after that night. Alex would have noticed something about Naofumi's egg though one day, and that would be of course the fact that it was beginning to crack or seemingly hatch. More so hatch that, well, Alex was thinking, because of the fact that he had saw the egg begin to rattle around from time to time. He could see it move, and he would actually alert Naofumi of it, which would surprise Naofumi as well. He thought that it wouldn't have hatched for another month or so, but it had only been a couple of days since he bought the egg from the trader. Although it wasn't a dragon like he was hoping for, he at least got a pretty legendary beast in the form of a griffin by the end of the day. The very next day, they would stumble upon a village by the name of Loot Village, where he would, well, try to sell some of the monster corpses and skins, but he would be disappointed in finding out just how low of a price they were being sold for in comparison to when he was still in the capital. Although he had to, well, convince some of the merchants to give him a better price, considering that they knew of his, well, quote-unquote actions as the Warhammer hero so far. But the people here, they didn't seem to even really acknowledge Naofumi's, well, record. As a matter of fact, they seemed to be not even all that concerned. They would actually explain that, well, there was apparently a coal mine that Naofumi could go to in order to pick up some valuable ores and sell it, but it was a rather dangerous coal mine up there, since there were also monsters in the coal mines. They were willing to take chances though. The worst that could happen was that, well, they died, but yeah, Naofumi didn't believe that they were going to die. That was the worst case scenario, and in the best case scenario, they were going to get these valuable ores. They were going to get stronger. It just sounded like there were a lot more pros and cons when going up there to recover the ores. So the trio, they would head up to the mountain area where the coal mine was located, and they would immediately be attacked by a two-headed dog upon entering. Yeah, Naofumi would immediately swing his hammer at the monster though, swatting it away. Alex would actually be amazed by Naofumi's strength. He wasn't even sure if he could have handled that monster himself, but Naofumi did effortlessly. Alex would praise Naofumi's strength, boosting the hammer wielder's, well, ego a little bit. The baby griffin would have begun to peck at the corpse of the two-headed dog, while Naofumi collected the metal ores in order to sell them for, well, some quick cash. That monster also helped Naofumi level up, so it wasn't a loss whatsoever in this situation, in his opinion. As they were getting ready to leave, Naofumi would call for the baby griffin to return to his side. Alex would mention something about giving the griffin a name, to which Naofumi, he would simply name them Spirit. He wasn't really that creative with names, and the most that he could really come up with was like calling them Spirit out there, well, Spirit Airlines, he supposed, just in case they were a bad, well, flying griffin. Or maybe he could just tax a bunch of people. if they ever wanted to ride on his pet griffin. A week would pass from there, with Naofumi and Alex finding and fighting monsters. They would gather precious minerals along the way and continue to sell them until they had gathered enough money to upgrade their equipment. They also needed to get something for Spirit, considering they had grown rather large during the week as well. Not only that, but they showed that they could switch between a griffin form and human form like Alex with his organist form. The only problem with that was the fact that they needed to get them some special clothing that stretched to meet the user's demands like Alex's clothing. Alex would have ended up leading Naofumi to an area where they could get the required tools for creating such clothing. They had to fight another monster to find the jewel, but it was well worth it, and well, the new was fairly weak as well. It was a level 10 monster, while Naofumi was like level 27. Alex was a level 20, and Spirit was, you could say, 18. They would visit a local tailor. They would visit a local tailor with the necessary items, and it wouldn't take very long to get Spirit a dress. It was a red and cream colored dress that worked well with Spirit's long brown hair. The trio would end up heading back to the capital in order to meet up with Erhard and get their weapons upgraded. And now for Mi's case, he wanted to make a custom order, which included spiked shoulder and knee pads, a skull-like helmet, and gauntlets. As for Alex, he ended up picking up a trident to use in battle. He didn't want to use that rusty old sword anymore. That rusty old beat up sword, he was tired of it. Spirit, well, they would go for a pair of claws. She figured that she could add them to her move arsenal while in her human form. She could use her talents when she was in her griffin form, so having claws in her human form, it would be a rather similar experience. Now for me would also be informed about how the Dragon Hourglass dictated the time people had left before the next wave. It was inside of the church, and now for me would be sure to check it out later. He would spend most of the day though just scrolling through his skills and trying to figure out any new moves that he could do. By this point, Naofumi had finally managed to get a grasp for consistently making constructs with this green energy of his, but he felt as if there was even more, something more that he could do with this green energy, this mysterious green energy of his. There was just so much more potential behind it that he was just trying to figure out. He remembered about there being a shield hero at one point, but they never seemed to have appeared, at least within this world or country. For all he knew, maybe they ended up going to Silk World or something. He heard about them a couple of times from ongoing villagers, but never really anything about the shield hero. He didn't necessarily know why. He would actually take into consideration maybe mixing a shield with his green energy, like maybe make a shield weapon or something. No. As a matter of fact, now for me, he had a better idea. He could create weapon constructs without consequence, so maybe he could create something akin to shields to block certain attacks from enemies, but why just have it stay a shield? Why would you bother having it be a shield that only envelops like your forearm or something, when you could turn it into a whole force field like in those video games where you were probably dealing with like these high-tech constructs or like these high-tech weaponry or something along these lines. Basically, there are going to be these guys in these MMO games that just had their armies go against yours, and for some reason, all of a sudden, one time, their enemies, they had force fields active, which for a medieval game, Naofumi called them out for just how that made no sense even when using magic. They didn't even explain that they were using magic. They were trying to say that, oh, they had this ancient technology or whatever, but Naofumi planned on adding this concept to his move arsenal. It wouldn't have actually taken Naofumi that long to learn how to create these force fields either, which he was actually pretty grateful for. You see, his issue right now was just properly gauging the necessary size of his force fields. They were pretty draining if we made them too big repeatedly, and he didn't want to make them too small either, to where somebody could just completely negate that, or like they could just completely just shoot, and well, although Naofumi had a force field active, it wouldn't have actually hit the force field, but it would still hit Naofumi instead, due to just how small the force field was, barely covering any part of Naofumi's body. That was something that he had to work with. That was something that he had to deal with, trying when it came onto, well, the proper gauge of the force fields. And while Naofumi was busy with that, you see Alex and Spirit, oh, they will be busy sparring, using their newest weapons, and just trying to get a feel for them. They would only stop sparring when it got dark. And of course, the next day, Naofumi would get his armor from the weapon shop owner. He would be pleased with how well it came out. He would head over to the clock tower afterwards, but he would find himself, well, looking at the church a bit oddly. He would find something off about the church that he was walking into. It seemed as if the only weapon showing as some sort of symbol of the church was that of the sword, spear, and bow, those three heroes. But the shield and, well, the hammer hero, the Warhammer hero's weapons, they weren't part of the symbol whatsoever, which left him scratching his head as to why that was the case. He was suspicious now. Did that mean that people only worship those three heroes? And if so, what did that mean about the shield and Warhammer hero? Was it possible that this had some correlation with how the king treated him that day? Why Mai made such an accusation against Naofumi? After all, this did seem to be the capital's main religion, so Naofumi would just decide to hold that thought while being escorted to the Dragon Hourglass. The time he had left would be displayed, counting down by minutes. The other three heroes would not arrive. And, well, of course they would arrive. The other three heroes wouldn't have arrived not too long later, and they would actually be surprised to see Naofumi there. Motoyasu wasn't pleased whatsoever seeing Naofumi though. The two of them would lock eyes, but Naofumi would smirk, breaking eye contact. Motoyasu would try to say something, but Naofumi would stop that from happening. Naofumi would state that it would be in Motoyasu's best interest to hold his tongue, not to waste his energy trying to speak. That energy ought to be conserved for the waves, considering how weak and pathetic of a person he already was. He'd be doing everyone a disservice by speaking now. Naofumi would quickly leave for this party afterwards, since he was already upset seeing both mine and Motoyasu there. He used the taunting as a method of channeling his anger towards them instead of just bashing them with his hammer. He didn't know how that would end up affecting the waves. He didn't want to jeopardize his own chances of surviving the wave after all, because of his transgressions against these two. He was smarter than that. Naofumi would wait out the rest of the time he had before the wave, and he would instantly be teleported to the area where the wave was taking place when the time was up. He would have Alex and Spirit find Loot Village in order to protect the people there from the wave. He liked that area. It would be a waste for the place to be destroyed with how valuable it could be in Naofumi's future endeavors. He could probably turn it into maybe his own base of operations if he really wanted to. Naofumi trusted the two of them to be able to handle any sort of issues that were at Loot Village. He trained them well. Meanwhile, Naofumi would deal with the big boss of this wave. It seemed like the other three heroes had a similar idea as they all went rushing to find the boss of the wave. It would turn out to be a chimera, which Naofumi would end up just getting the first shot at, which that would surprise Itsuki. Naofumi would have made a spear construct before throwing it at the chimera. It would pierce the monster's side, but Naofumi wouldn't have been done. As a matter of fact, he would blast the monster with fireballs created from the mysterious green energy he wielded and bash their head in with his hammer. Itsuki and Ren would have covered Naofumi's blind spots, while Motoyasu, he would just be annoyed having to help Naofumi in all of this, but he would blast through the chimera's eyes, blinding them. It would have taken a significantly less amount of time than in the original for the four to have defeated the boss. The wave would have ended after they beat the boss, and he would go to check on Alex and Spirit. He would be impressed with how well they managed to handle protecting the villagers, and he would applaud them. The villagers would have shown their gratitude for Alex and Spirit saving them during the wave. Alex and Spirit would have greeted their leader right after, asking how well he dealt with the boss of the wave, and the villagers, realizing Naofumi's connection to their saviors, would thank him as well for helping out in the wave. They would have realized that he was a Warhammer hero and that he was out dealing with the boss of the wave, according to, what Alex and Spirit were saying. According to the context clues given to them, the fact that he had his party members deal with the monsters in Loot Village implied that his strength was to a point that he didn't have to rely on them in order to defeat the boss. And the fact that he was willing to just have them go and protect Loot Village out of all the villages out there. They could have even protected the capital, but no, they decided to go to Loot Village specifically. That just showed how much loyalty they were going to have towards Naofumi afterwards. They trusted Naofumi more than the other heroes already, just for that one action. There was one thing that bugged Naofumi though, when it came on to the villagers. Although they were praising Naofumi for his accomplishment during the wave, they would also acknowledge that he had help from the other three heroes. They were implying that he and the other three heroes, they were the main reason why the boss was defeated, when in all honesty, Naofumi was a main heavy hitter in the whole fight. Sure, the other heroes managed to contribute something, but Naofumi would have been good all on his own. He didn't need the other three heroes to support him, but they hadn't seen a fight, so they just went off with assumption that all four heroes contributed an equal amount in defeating the boss, and Naofumi would just let this one slide for now. He would let them think that for now, not really seeing what he could get out of informing them of the fact that he was a main contributor in defeating the boss. Naofumi would hear about there being some sort of feast to commemorate a successful wave at the king's castle later on, and the heroes were going to even be rewarded as well. Considering that he did most of the work, Naofumi only found it fair that, he attended as well and reaped his rewards rather than the other heroes hogging everything for themselves. Old Gray would be upset seeing Naofumi there, but he would do his best to keep a positive look on his face while all these guests were here. Naofumi would have been at the feast with Alex and Spirit, who were consuming the food like their stomachs were black holes. Naofumi would have stood in the corner watching them. Eventually they could afford to eat like this every day. That day was far away from now though. He was going to make sure that they were going to be able to live their lives in luxury. Especially now for me, he wanted to live his life in luxury the most, but he also wanted his party members, those who were loyal to him, to have some sort of a good life as well. He would turn his head and notice mine whispering something to Motoyasu afterwards, so suddenly Motoyasu would approach Naofumi with a scowl on his face. He would take off his glove and throw it to the ground, making an outburst. And, well, this outburst would have been based around Naofumi being a sick and vile creature. Naofumi would be confused, but Motoyasu would let it be known to everybody in the room that Naofumi's party members were slaves, bending to Naofumi's every word. They had no free will, and they were just doing everything that Naofumi told them to do because of the fact that they had slave marks on them. And he guaranteed that if it weren't for the fact that they had slave marks on them, they would not listen to anything Naofumi was telling them. They wouldn't even be part of Naofumi's party right now. Motoyasu would declare that he would free them from their miserable existence under the tyranny of Naofumi. Naofumi would laugh hearing this though, questioning how exactly would Motoyasu do such a thing, especially since they were already loyal to Naofumi, even without the slave marks. Motoyasu would just scoff at hearing that last part, them being loyal to Naofumi of all people, even without the slave marks. He found that hard to believe. Motoyasu, though, he would actually explain that he would fight Naofumi for their freedom. Naofumi's next question would be simple. If Naofumi won in a fight against Motoyasu, what would he gain in return? At first, Motoyasu would say he would receive nothing. Naofumi would slam his hammer onto the ground though, cracking the floor beneath them. He would ask Motoyasu to repeat his words and be very careful with how he spoke. Motoyasu would scoff once again, faking confidence. And he would actually explain that if Naofumi somehow managed to defeat him in battle, he'd be willing to give him his next earnings for the month. Naofumi would deny this offer though. He wanted a better wage than just that, since he could probably make more money than Motoyasu if he tried hard enough. He would give Motoyasu an offer that he couldn't refuse instead. Motoyasu could use his weapon freely throughout the fight, while Naofumi simply used his fists and skills he gained that didn't require the use of his hammer. If Motoyasu won, Naofumi would give up ownership of his party members, never purchase a slave again, and even give him his earnings for the next 2 months. If Naofumi won, on the other hand, he'd get Motoyasu's earnings for the next month, but not just that. He'd point to the king for this, as a matter of fact. He would declare that another reward would be that Naofumi gained lordship of Loot Village. Alt-Cray would be speechless hearing this. Motoyasu would have been confident in his current abilities. That time where Naofumi was able to defeat him in one punch was long behind him now. Naofumi simply got lucky that time around, or at least that was, well, Motoyasu's coping mechanism at the time. But this was going to be a real test of their strength. Naofumi had also intentionally handicapped himself, so Motoyasu believed that he had this in the bag. He believed that he had the edge in this battle. He would have the edge in the battle. He would have ended up accepting the wager for this fight, and the two would be on their way. Naofumi would have had his weapon around his waist when they went inside the arena. He would have even had some rope around his waist and everything, making sure that the hammer stayed around his waist the whole entire fight. But Motoyasu was ready to or wiped the cocky smirk off of Naofumi's face as soon as they entered. As soon as they were given the go to start the fight, Motoyasu would charge towards Naofumi with his spear in hand. Naofumi would have folded his arms and stood still. Motoyasu saw that Naofumi had let himself be wide open, and he would just think internally that this guy was going to regret being so cocky. Right when he was about to strike, a barrier blocked him off from Naofumi. He was confused. Naofumi would just laugh before walking up to Motoyasu, grabbing his collar, and throwing him to a wall. Motoyasu's collision with the wall would have been strong enough to leave a crater in the wall. Motoyasu already felt dazed from that one attack, but that wouldn't be the end of the onslaught though. Unfortunately. For Motoyasu at the very least. Naofumi would have appeared before Motoyasu, punching him in the gut and breaking his armor around that area as well. Motoyasu would have coughed up blood, questioning where this strength was coming from. There was no way Naofumi could have improved that rapidly. They all started at level 1, so what made Naofumi so special? Naofumi would drag Motoyasu out to the crater, to which Motoyasu would use this moment in order to attack again. Naofumi would actually be rather surprised to find that Motoyasu could even muster enough strength in order to even lift his weapon, let alone go for a strike. This shock would have been short-lived though, since Naofumi would quickly create a force field, blocking another one of Motoyasu's attacks. He would pound Motoyasu into the ground, waiting for him to declare that he surrendered. His whole point in this fight was to crush Motoyasu's spirit. That was why he even handicapped himself in the first place as well. To handicap himself and still be able to win would literally destroy Motoyasu. This was Naofumi's whole goal, but Naofumi would have felt a blast of wind be sent his way. Naofumi's armor was just too sturdy at this point though for him to simply be blown away by it. He would look up to see Mine and tell her to stay out of this. He could care less about her wanting to protect a little boy toy. He got himself into this mess, so he had to suffer the consequences. Motoyasu would have been humiliated all throughout this fight. His body was a battered mess by the end of it. Despite that, Naofumi was still going. He wanted him to say the words to end it all. He wouldn't get the pleasure in hearing the words though. Instead, the king would have been the one to call off the fight, declaring that Naofumi was the victor of this fight against Motoyasu. Although this would have been begrudgingly. Naofumi would be rewarded with lordship over Loot Village, but his money would be confiscated as a fee to pay for Motoyasu's medical expenses while receiving healing potions. Naofumi wouldn't have even been too upset over that. He got what he mainly wanted out of all this, and that was lordship over Loot Village. With him officially having control over the village, Naofumi would head there in order to establish it as his base. He'd train up the men in order to help fight in future calamities, while a woman would be on the more maternal side of things, essentially being the healers and cooks. Farming would be more of a unisex role though. Naofumi would have received a book about magic as a gift from one of the villagers, which he would do his best to study from. For several days, Naofumi would have devoted a good amount of his time in either seeing the development of Loot Village or learning magic. It would have only been a couple of weeks, but Naofumi would have created a militia in the form of a small village. Naofumi would create a symbol to let everyone who came to this village know that it was under the rule of him. He'd leave the village for now in order to expand his territory and spread his name. He'd come across an accessory merchant who was surrounded by some thugs early on in this new journey of his, and he would have Spirit deal with the thugs by turning into a griffin form, swooping in to get rid of as many of the thugs as possible. The remaining thugs would be terrified, believing this to be a stray griffin, and run away in fear. They didn't want to get eaten. Naofumi would find these guys to have been absolutely pathetic. Not even willing to attempt to defend themselves against Spirit. Come on, man. And they wanted to pick on someone who was in no position to fight, but as soon as somebody stronger came into fray, they wanted to act like cowards. Like, nah, keep that same energy. Keep that same energy through and through. He had respect for like those idiots at the very least, because even if they try to go up against somebody stronger than them, they would at least try and fight. But as soon as you find somebody that's stronger than you one of these thugs, you try and pick on somebody that's smaller than you. When somebody say that, oh, pick on somebody your own size, nah, we good. That's basically how Naofumi was seeing it when it came onto these guys. Absolute cowards. But Naofumi would end up going over to the accessory dealer, who would have been petrified seeing the griffin until they had turned into their humanoid form, causing for him to calm down somewhat. And Naofumi would actually explain that he even had nothing to fear. The griffin was one of Naofumi's party members, so she listened to him. The accessory dealer would be grateful for their help, and he would actually offer them some of his money as a show of gratitude. But Naofumi didn't have any real desire for his money this time around, though. Instead, he wanted to have the man spread word of Naofumi's presence. He wanted him to carry Naofumi's symbol around as a form of protection, striking fear into any who had malicious intents. The two would part ways afterwards. And Naofumi would end up hearing some rumors of there being a village that was apparently being taken over by some plant infestation a couple of days ago. Well, the village apparently a couple of days ago ended up going through some sort of plant infestation, and it was still carrying on to this day. And Naofumi had a bad feeling about this, that one of the other heroes had something to do with this. They were incompetent in comparison to Naofumi. He could tell from that one fight with the Chimera boss. He and Alex would soar on top of Spirit in order to find a village. It was an eyesore with how easy it was to find, though. Naofumi would simply burn away at the overgrown roots and eventually find a source, crushing it in his hands. And the people would have been grateful towards Naofumi for saving them from the plant and all. But they would also explain how the spear hero, Motoyasu, appeared in this village earlier on, declaring that the king had made him the lord over this village. He brought a special seed which was meant to help them prosper since they were in a bit of a famine and all, but that seed seemed to be cursed with how it grew out of control. Naofumi wasn't necessarily surprised, in all honesty, when he was reading that magical book. It was in a language he didn't understand. He had to get someone to decipher the words for him while he was in Loot Village, but it appeared that Motoyasu had no such interpreter. That resulted in this mess. Naofumi would let the people know that from now on, they wanted Naofumi's rule. He didn't care what the king said, since Motoyasu was too incompetent to handle anything. He couldn't even properly lead his own party if they let him pick up some cursed seed like that with no one saying anything. What kind of blind loyalty is that? They were just blindly listening to every word that came out of his mouth. That's at least Naofumi's conclusion. They were no good. Well, they were no better than foot soldiers, really. But they were not allies. they needed to be allies, they needed to be partners, they needed to be party members, not foot soldiers. Shoot, Naofumi was creating a militia. He was creating his own army of foot soldiers, people who were just going to blindly listen to Naofumi over time. But when it came on to Alex and Spirit, they were different. They were his party members. They were supposed to make sure that he was going to be set onto the right pathway, a pathway for success in this world. But it seemed as if Motoyasu, he just didn't have that. So Naofumi would also explain that he set up a militia back in Loot Village that also counted as a farming area. That maybe, well, the people in this village could, well, go to. You could probably set up a form of trade between the two. There was bound to be something valuable that they could trade for food, considering the fact that they were going through a famine right now. They could mutually benefit off of this trading. He'd suggest sending their strongest in order to do the trade with Loot Village. He would leave his symbol there before leaving the village. The next place Naofumi ended up going to was a place that had seemingly been plagued by disease. He was in the sky, but could easily tell where the source of the illness was coming from. He would soar down close enough to just burn away at the corpse of the dragon that was left on the mountain area. He wasn't going to risk getting sick himself. That's why he made sure not to get too close. He just needed to make sure to get close enough to where it was certain his fireball attack would actually hit. Once Naofumi was able to confirm that the monster had been completely incinerated, he would signal for spirits to make their way down to the village. Though many were still ill, a couple were still standing. Naofumi would give the people there a suggestion. This suggestion would be to just abandon this village, burn the bodies of the ill if they didn't show any signs of recovering in the next 30 days, since the illness may just spread instead. Heading over to Loot Village would probably be their best shot at surviving at this point. He created a militia there, but they could still prove to be of some use if they couldn't help with the front lines. There were other occupations such as farming. The people would be wary of leaving the village they had grown up in and known for all their lives, but Naofumi would remind them that this place was full of sick individuals. He questioned how they even became sick in the first place, to which one of the villagers explained that the sword hero Ren came here to slay a dragon, which ended up saving them, but unfortunately he left the dragon on a mountain, where it just decayed, and the fumes exuding off the corpse was enough to make the people sick. Naofumi would facepalm hearing this. He knew Motoyasu was an idiot, but he would have never guessed that Ren was one as well. Some of the villagers would listen to Naofumi though and begin to leave their homes, seeing it as nothing but a wasteland now thanks to the work of the sword heroes' incompetency. Within the next few days, Loot Village would have had an influx of newcomers thanks to Naofumi's influence. Some were here to partake in trading with their villagers, while others took on jobs in the village. Some joined the military, while others took on construction work. A few became farmers as well. Naofumi would check on the state of the village and be pleased to see it prosper. The village where the dragon was slain, Naofumi would end up just converting into a training ground for himself and his party members. With the current state of Loot Village, Naofumi figured that they would be pretty self-sufficient. They would be able to fend for themselves for a while. And Naofumi would use this time that he had to himself in order to train Alex and Spirit. He'd been studying magic for a while now, so he found this to be the perfect opportunity in order to teach his party members. He already knew that Alex had a natural affinity towards water magic. He'd seen Alex use it before, but he wanted to teach him a bit more. He would end up teaching, Alex how to channel his water magic through his trident. And he would also find out that Alex seemingly had an affinity towards lightning magic as well. I don't know why it was so hard to say that. Spirit, on the other hand, well, they will be found to have an affinity towards wind magic. Who would have figured? Naofumi wasn't surprised at all, in all honesty, considering the race of these two individuals. Well, you have to admit, when it came onto the lightning magic part, that was what surprised him. Air magic for, spirit, that was not surprising whatsoever. And when it came onto the water magic, he'd already seen, Alex used water magic before, so this wasn't at all a surprise to Naofumi. What would be surprising though was how fast they managed to learn new skills. He'd be impressed, actually. Naofumi would have witnessed Alex creating water bullets and water constructs while Spirit created wind blades and air cannons. That was just day one though. Matter of fact, as the days went by, Alex would have been using something similar to like a railgun for his at least lightning magic. He'd watched some anime before, and with how Alex was channeling his lightning magic, it was possibly kind of similar to a magical index railgun edition. Maybe. He wasn't all that sure. He'd only watched 2-3 episodes at best, but that was the closest comparison he could make with how he was using his lightning magic. He supposed maybe sort of like Killua as well, but that was kind of a stretch. The two would just continue to evolve their skills while under the tutelage of Naofumi, and Loot Village would only continue to evolve while under Naofumi's authority as well. Eventually, Naofumi would have taught the soldiers magic, although it would be the very basics of it, just being able to get a grasp for what magic was. Alex and Spirit, they would be in charge of most of the magic lessons after they became fairly skilled themselves. By the time the third wave had started, Naofumi would have had a proper frontline protection for Loot Village, so that they would be able to defend themselves, and Alex and Spirit could probably go around fighting more monsters rather than having to be secluded or literally just limited to Loot Village. Each soldier was at least competent enough in the fundamentals of magic and visibly adept as well. Naofumi would leave the safety of his land to his soldiers and head out to find the boss of this wave like last time. Naofumi would have made it in time to see the other heroes actually arguing about something instead of fighting a boss. And Naofumi would have had a quizzical look on his face. He was confused as to what could possibly be more important than to just be standing there arguing instead of fighting the boss. Speaking of boss, where exactly was the boss of this wave? Were they in hiding or just in another location? Spirit would actually answer Naofumi's question though by destroying a ship, revealing that the Soul Eater was indeed hiding there the whole time. They were probably hoping to get a sneak attack on the others. Naofumi would use this moment to belittle the rest of the heroes for their pure incompetence. Naofumi would point out that it only took one spirit to find a boss, while these three heroes, it seemed as if not even three of them could screw in a single light bulb. Motoyasu would lash out at Naofumi, telling him to shut his mouth, but Naofumi would stand his ground. He wasn't intimidated in the slightest by Motoyasu. It was the other way around, and Motoyasu was doing his best to keep a form of strength among his fellow heroes. He was trying to feign confidence, feign that he was still a very capable person, and that he was not falling behind. The Soul Eater, they would just use this time in order to charge up an attack, made up of dark magic and blasted from out of their mouth. The four heroes would dodge, but Naofumi would be quick to get back up and attack the monster. There was something different about this monster though, but he couldn't point out what exactly was different. Naofumi would originally try to swing his hammer at the Soul Eater but failed. It simply went right through the monster. There, Naofumi would realize that physical attacks didn't work on the monster whatsoever, so his best chance now was his use of magic. Naofumi had become rather advanced with this magic of his at this point, so he had no problem attacking with it. This seemed like the perfect opportunity actually. Naofumi would use a blend of elemental attacks in order to put down the Soul Eater, but they still had some strength left over after that. The other heroes were trying to fend off against the Soul Eater, but it was becoming abundantly clear that they were struggling to meet the difficulty curve. They barely made any damage to the Soul Eater in comparison to Naofumi. Right when Naofumi was about to finish out the Soul Eater, someone else would arrive, killing the Soul Eater and stealing Naofumi's kill. He would be upset with this, but he wouldn't have had enough time to dwell on it for very long, since the one who stole Naofumi's kill would suddenly try to go for his head. A force field would be created though, blocking the attack of a woman who appeared to be using fans as a weapon. She wore a kimono as well, and she'd introduce herself to the heroes by explaining that she was here to kill all of them. They were all gathered here at once, so this was her perfect opportunity. Glass wouldn't have expected for Spirit and Alex to suddenly get in her way though by charging an attack at her as well. By charging at her as well, I should say. Alex would have been standing on top of Spirit, and he would have used an aerial attack in order to at least halt Glass's movements, using a mixture of water bullets and lightning bullets as well. He would have tried creating a hailstorm, and he would have also tried sending lightning down to strike Glass. All of these moves, but Glass would break through their defenses rather easily. Their main purpose wasn't to actually damage her though. Instead, it was to just serve as a distraction here, so that Naofumi would have the perfect opportunity to rush at this strange woman and try to knock her out with a single punch. He wanted to ask her questions instead of straight up killing her. He could tell that she was different from what he was used to dealing with, even stranger than that Soul Eater. Although the punch was able to disorient Glass, this wasn't enough to stop her pursuit. Naofumi wouldn't have enough time to put up a force field in this battle. Not again. He would be forced to take Glass fairly seriously here. She was actually strong. He'd do his best not to kill her, but she kept pushing his tolerance. His tolerance, his patience, all of it in this battle, and eventually Naofumi, he would just be forced to use his warhammer and split her head with it. Naofumi would have looked at his arms and realized she managed to make him bleed. The first person that had ever made him bleed in the entirety of this time that he had spent in this world was her. Naofumi would question whether or not there were more out there who were like, Glass, people who could injure him to such an extent. If there are more like her out there, maybe he could recruit them, join forces with him, they could maybe he could have them join forces with him, since it would be a waste of time to just kill all of them. If they were against him though, well obviously he would have no choice but to kill them, he'd supposed. But he was really hoping to not have to go that route. They would just mess with his plans if they decided to go against him each and every time. And Naofumi's presence, it would be requested by the king after the end of the wave. You see, news had apparently spread about how Naofumi was able to defeat a foe that none of the other heroes could have even handled. King Old Cray wanted to know the secret behind Naofumi's strength. What made him so much stronger than the other heroes? It seemed to be a consistent thing with the Warhammer heroes in the past, but Naofumi had been by far the most impressive. It was something Old Cray begrudgingly had to admit to. Like, especially these moves, such as like him shooting energy out of his eyes, these weapon constructs, all of this wasn't something that was prevalent in other Warhammer heroes, so they were trying to have things add up right now. Now for me, he would smirk though, hearing this. He could use this to his advantage. He would tell Alt Cray the source of his strength on one condition. You see, that condition would be that he surrender his throne to Naofumi. Alt Cray would be appalled hearing this, and he would order for his guards to escort Naofumi out of his presence immediately. Naofumi would leave the castle with the guards. He wouldn't even put up any sort of resistance. But on his way out, he would remind the king of one thing that he had said before. His time on the throne wouldn't last for much longer. The king wouldn't know what Naofumi meant at first, until a few days later, that he heard reports of there being an uprising. Someone had apparently been gathering an army to go against the king. His eyes would widen in fear hearing this. He demanded to know who the leader of this revolt was. He had a feeling he already knew who it was though, and sure enough, it was Naofumi. He'd have all of his soldiers at the front lines alongside the other three cardinal heroes and their respective parties. Surely Naofumi wasn't strong enough to take on such an army like this. They'd keep watch of the capital day in and day out, day and night, paranoid of Naofumi. They were waiting for when his individual army was going to come and arrive. It was only a matter of time now. They wouldn't have realized that Naofumi was just far beyond anything that they were capable of handling now. For you see, after the third wave, Naofumi had studied more about magic, specifically the dark arts, the arts of magic that was not meant to be seen by regular eyes. Naofumi, he decided to go deeper into the lore of magic though. He would eventually find some books on the dark arts, and he would end up reading from them. He would have learned the language at this point in time, and he would have been able to decipher the words, and from all of this new knowledge that was being bestowed to Naofumi, he would have ended up creating a couple of new moves. He seemed to have more of an affinity towards this sort of magic for some reason, considering how quickly he picked them up, and he would have actually gained the ability to clone himself with this magic. And not only that, but he could revive others as well. Death meant nothing anymore. He could even create entirely new bodies, although that one, since it was rather new to his arsenal, required him to use more focus. That was also the most complex of his magical abilities thus far. Naofumi Naofumi was able to convince the people of Loot Village to begin a revolution against the king by revealing the corrupt nature of the king. He sprinkled a couple of lies in there as well to really win the people over. I mean, whoever said honesty is the best policy lied, in Naofumi's opinion. He'd heard all about politics over the years. He knew what politics was like in the real world, and he realized the only way you were going to really get far in society was if you lied. If you tried to keep an honest face throughout all of it, you were just going to suffer in the end. If you really wanted to get what you wanted, if you really had this dream of yours, and you wanted to have this dream, be fulfilled, you would not be able to go the honest route. If you wanted to live a comfortable life, you would have to lie. If you wanted greatness, you would have to lie. That was something that Naofumi realized, and that was exactly the sort of skill that he was using here when lying to the villagers. You sprinkle in a little bit of lies here and there, you sprinkle in a little bit of truth, you end up gaining people's hearts. They were already rather loyal to Naofumi with everything that he had done for them, so it wasn't too hard to even give them the results of fight either. And, of course, they would rampage throughout the kingdom, taking down one city after another. Naofumi would spread his propaganda throughout all these cities, causing some people to convert to his side. And with all of this violence that was ensuing because of Naofumi, his system would actually become warped to fit his twisted mind. This warped system embraced Naofumi's mindset about this world, and as a gift from the system, Naofumi was given an ability that would really help with his world domination. By the time Naofumi made it to the capital, his army had grown massive. Monsters of all sizes and shapes were even part of Naofumi's army, who were well taken by some of his soldiers or people who had joined his resolve. They were recruited with these monsters that were like their slaves or pets or whatnot. So, Naofumi's military power, it would have easily exceeded that of the king's own. The king simply stood no chance against Naofumi in this current state. And Naofumi would declare that from this day forth, this would be his kingdom. Motoyasu, Itsuki, and Ren, each of them would reject this claim though and charge at Naofumi, only for Naofumi to easily handle them. He didn't kill them though. He instead forced them to watch his display of power as he suddenly activated the skill that the new system had granted him. He had been excited to use this for a while now. He didn't know when he was going to he knew exactly when he was going to use it. He knew that he was going to use it one of these days whenever he met with the king, or at least when he finally made it to the capital. He saved it specifically for them. He did not use it whatsoever when it came onto the other villages. No, he had a vendetta against the capital specifically. He would end up absorbing the souls of several soldiers on the king's side and imprison them inside of himself. Those who were lucky would run away in fear as Naofumi's army marched forward. The three heroes would realize that Naofumi was no longer a human, but instead he had become a demon. This was pretty much the closest they could really compare Naofumi to at this point. There was absolutely no way a human would be willing to or could be able to do such a thing, such a heinous thing like what Naofumi was literally doing right now, absorbing these souls. This was beyond comprehension for most of them. And Naofumi truly was unstoppable at this point. Because, you see, with him absorbing these souls, Naofumi's level would also increase drastically within a matter of seconds from absorbing those souls. And the fear of the other heroes for Naofumi, it would only increase as well. They wouldn't have been aware of the fact that Naofumi also gained these soldiers' skills, their combat skills, and their memories as well. The memories filled up the holes he once had about his existence in this world. It all made sense now. He'd make his way to the throne room with Alex and Spirit in tow, basically, and quickly dealing with the king's guards. And Alex would have specifically manipulated the water within some of the guards in order to rupture their hearts, ending them cleanly. Spirit would have used her wind magic in order to dice up the remainder of the guards. Now, it was just the king left. He was sweating bullets at this point. He never expected to have been put in such a position. Naofumi would express his desire to deal with the king personally, which meant that both Alex and Spirit were to lay off right now. He would walk up to Altcray's throne, explaining everything that he had recently learned about his status as a Warhammer hero. The Warhammer hero, unlike the spear, sword, and bow hero, was not worshipped by the people of this country. Instead, he was depicted as a demon, akin to the shield hero, the last Warhammer hero. He was indeed a valiant warrior, but there was something off about the stories that were told about him. In every depiction, he was understood to have been devoutly loyal to the kingdom and was incredibly strong as well. He died protecting the king, but if that was the case, why would Altcray treat Naofumi in such a manner from the day he came to this world? And why would the kingdom only ever worship the first three heroes? Why not the Warhammer hero as well? Were they just trying to fulfill some propaganda? Naofumi had his theories. Something wasn't adding up, and Naofumi ended up coming to his own conclusion though. That, of course, being that the last Warhammer hero wasn't as loyal as people thought he was. He also had his own doubts about the king, which, in all honesty, Naofumi could not blame him for. Naofumi already had his doubts about this king really being able to lead the kingdom, so he could only imagine how it was for the last Warhammer hero as well. Just how idiotic could King Altcray be? And, well, there needed to be a more competent ruler. That's probably what the last Warhammer hero was thinking. Someone akin to his dear wife, Queen Morelia, the true ruler of this kingdom, while Altcray, he just flaunted his supposed power while she was gone, to lead the kingdom to ruin so easily while she was away really said something about his capability of leading others. Maybe it would have been best to put someone else in charge. This was probably what was going through the last guy's mind. The king probably got worried of it though, and before the hero became too strong, he made sure to end his life before such a revolution like this one could have happened. They were probably in cahoots with the shield hero as well, who was in, well, the kingdom of Siltvelt at the time. And the king probably figured that summoning as many of the heroes to this kingdom as possible would have allowed him to have proper control over the Warhammer hero this time around. But it was only now that the king realized that he was wrong. incredibly wrong, actually. That was all of Naofumi's assumptions, though. Just an analytical guess before he killed the king. Naofumi was about to swing his hammer and crush the older man's skull, but someone would actually beg for Naofumi to stop. He'd pause, intent to see who dare interrupt him, and to his surprise, it would be the queen herself. The queen that he was just talking about. She would actually explain that she made sure to come here as soon as possible when she found out what had become of the kingdom and the stupidity of her husband. She apologized to Naofumi on behalf of both mine and the king. If he were to end the war right now, she would agree to any sort of arrangements he desired, so long as no one else had to die. Naofumi would put down his hammer and state his demands. The first one would be King Old Crane being the ruler of this country, or like the king of this country. Yeah, no, that's dead. You see, Naofumi, from here on out, he will be a new ruler of this country, of this kingdom. The queen explained that could be arranged through marriage and marriage only. Naofumi, he had no qualms with that. Old Cray would try to say something, but Morelia would point towards him and state that his speaking privileges had been revoked. His royal status would be stripped, and their marriage was from here on out null and void. Naofumi also wanted access to any and all funds of this kingdom. Any sort of political decisions he made were not to be questioned either. The queen would agree to all of this and more. In the passing days, the kingdom would be rebuilt, but in Naofumi's image. Statues and monuments of Naofumi would be built in his honor. The former king Oldcray would have been reduced to a commoner and laughingstock of his kingdom, with his thumbs being cut off as well. Naofumi would have married Queen Morelia and become mine's technical stepdad. Her and Melty's stepdad, actually. He'd meet the younger girl not too long after getting married to Morelia. Neither mine nor Melty liked this current position of theirs, but they had no choice but to accept it. Mine would have faced the consequences of her previous actions against Naofumi, though, and that would be her essentially being sold off into slavery in order to pay off her debts to the kingdom, which Naofumi only continued to pile up against her. Their three heroes would be forced to obey Naofumi's orders, being trained by Naofumi's soldiers to actually be effective in battle for once. They would still never hold a candle to Naofumi's strength at this point, though. Naofumi would have also conquered many kingdoms as well. The influence Naofumi had over the world would only continue to spread until he became a legend of sorts. He wanted to rule the entire world, and he would eventually accomplish it. The waves would cease to continue after a certain point. Even with the issue of the spirit towards us, Naofumi would handle it fairly easily by absorbing their soul. The book hero would have been shocked to meet a person like Naofumi and know that this world was ruled by him and him alone. Naofumi's strength would have been incalculable for the book hero, who would try to escape the bad scenario he was put in, only to get his soul drained as well. Learning of there being different worlds out there, Naofumi would become excited. This meant that he could conquer even more worlds, and his kingdom would only continue to expand. He liked that idea. He could even raise a heir to his throne for each world. It would all start with this world though, since this here had already been conceived by Queen Morelia. By Queen Morelia. And you want to know what the name of his year would be? It would be Katana. And that's the Titan Clan is the end for this movie. My throat is basically dead, but I hope you guys enjoyed the movie. It's your boy King Titan Next, just going to say that, hey, if you've been rocking for my content for a little while now, maybe hit that subscribe button, leave a little comment, maybe like the video as well, and share it to others who may be interested in this sort of content as well. Like, don't gatekeep people. But yeah, besides that, it's your boy King Titan Next signing out. Peace.
Rifty.